the Boston Celtics should be ashamed of themselves for the performance that they're putting up right now.
Tuesday night, the Celtics season ended at the hands of the Brooklyn Nets, and by Wednesday morning, things had changed dramatically.
Did anybody have this on their Celtics offseason bingo card?
The Celtics have their next head coach.
It's Ime Udoka.
Ime Udoka is facing disciplinary action.
Now the question, is Joe Mazzulla the man for the job?
Can we take a step back and talk about this Celtics starting lineup and just how good it is?
These guys are absolutely blitzing the league right now.
The time is June 2021. In the NBA world, the first round of the playoffs had just come to a conclusion. The Big Three Brooklyn Nets, led by Kevin Durant, had just humiliated the Boston Celtics, effortlessly beating them in 5. From top to bottom, the Celtics were a complete train wreck. The 2020-21 season saw Boston win their fewest games since 2014. Their roster was mediocre and ravaged with poor contracts. To make matters worse, Danny Ainge, the longtime team general manager, shockingly stepped down in a move that put Brad Stevens, a coach with no front office experience, in charge to clean up the mess. The narrative was stronger than ever. The Boston Celtics, once believed to have the brightest future in the league, had squandered their good fortune and ruined everything. A team that everyone believed would win at least one championship now appeared to be on the brink of blowing it up and trading their stars. Believe it or not, this was the harsh reality that the Celtics were facing back in 2021. But when we look at them in 2024, they're in a better spot than ever. In the 2023-24 season, the Celtics far and away won the most games out of any other team, and had the highest point differential while doing so. They built a dominant roster, boasting the best starting 5 in the league, to go along with a lethal bench. No other team matches them in star power. So how did they do it? How did the Boston Celtics, who appeared dead in the water in 2021, salvage their franchise and build the best roster in the NBA within just a few years? Today, we'll be looking at just that, and analyzing how the Boston Celtics went from stuck in the middle to a super team. In order to understand how the Celtics saved themselves from NBA purgatory, we must detail how they found themselves in such a position to begin with. 2 years before their collapse in 2019, the Celtics had incredibly high expectations, only to falter in the most embarrassing way imaginable. The 2018-19 Celtics, after being projected by many NBA analysts to win upwards of 67 games, won just 49, and were embarrassed in the second-round series versus the Bucks in a 5-game loss. Drama seeped out of the franchise from every corner, with star point guard Kyrie Irving being the culprit of much of the tension. After promising he'd re-sign with the team in October 2018, in June 2019, he dipped to the Brooklyn Nets after playing horribly in the 2019 playoffs. But it wasn't just drama. The Celtics team played a brand of basketball that was iso-centric and selfish. Players focused more on their stats and less on team play, leading to an unwatchable product on the court. For all these reasons and more, the ultra-talented 2019 Celtics failed to win anything of note after surprisingly reaching the Eastern Conference Finals 1 year before. This poor season put the franchise into a panic mode, and their anxiety was shown in free agency. In the summer of 2019, the Celtics, after losing Al Horford and Kyrie Irving, were desperate to fill the now large hole on their team. So they handed a max contract to Kemba Walker, an all-star guard. Within just a few months of playing with the team, Walker would succumb to disastrous knee injuries. As it turns out, signing a 6-foot-tall 29-year-old with years of mileage was risky, and this max contract would prove to be quite a thorn in the Celtics' side. The C's lost a bunch of talented players in free agency, but despite this, their 2019-20 campaign was still quite impressive. The vibes were much higher than the previous year, and the wins followed. The Celtics were in the 3rd seed and won 48 games out of 72. This was mostly due to the great play of Jason Tatum, who made his first All-Star appearance, along with Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, and Gordon Hayward. Another All-Star on the team was Kemba Walker, who quite literally played his last good stretch of games from October 2019 to February 2020. After the 2020 All-Star game, he was never the same due to injuries. In the bubble, the Celtics were outplayed by the Miami Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals, losing the series in 6. A disappointing ending, but with all things considered, This season was a huge positive and a step in the right direction for the organization. The miserable 2018-19 year had been washed away by this fun and exciting team that focused on sharing the ball and prioritizing unselfishness. However, while the organization appeared to be making progress, behind closed doors, things were falling apart. During the infamous bubble in the fall of 2020, longtime Celtics coach Brad Stevens was beginning to lose his mind. Stevens described the Orlando bubble as isolating, and often coped by walking around outside, calling it the walk of sanity. It was reported that he was worn down, and he had begun hating coaching. Not a good sign. The Celtics needed him, and if he was losing a passion for coaching, that would be an issue. On top of this, the team's roster outside of the top few players was looking more and more suspect. They lost Gordon Hayward, a starter, to the Charlotte Hornets, for the quote-unquote largest trade exception in NBA history, aka nothing. Then in free agency, they brought in a few old washed-up bench players like Tristan Thompson and Jeff Teague. Sorry, Jeff, I still love your podcast though, man.
I was like, what?
Many of Danny Ainge's first-round draft misses over the years were starting to bite him. Guys like Romeo Langford, Aaron Nesmith, and Carson Edwards were all players who contributed nothing to the team, despite the C's spending valued picks on them. So when actually examining the 2020-21 Celtics roster, it was quite the horrifying sight. We didn't know it at the time, but Kemba Walker's career was basically over due to his knee problems. So that left Tatum, Brown, Smart, and literally 2K auto-generated players. They tried to add depth pieces, like when they acquired the Magic's Evan Fournier, but that was just, So in reality, while it surprised some how bad the Celtics performed in 2020-21, it was kinda predictable if you had followed them closely. To top it off, injuries sabotaged them. Out of 72 games, Marcus Smart played just 48, Kemba Walker played 43, and Robert Williams, who's always injured, let's be honest, played 52. Even worse was a wrist injury to Jaylen Brown, the team's second best player, one that sidelined him for the entire 2021 playoffs. As a result, Jason Tatum was left on an island by himself. Despite his solid efforts, in round 1, his team was mollywopped by the big three in Brooklyn of Kyrie, KD, and James Harden in 5. To be a Celtics fan during this time was hellish. Seeing the hated villain Kyrie Irving not only beat you, but step on your logo was the ultimate getback. The Celtics were crushed. So how in the world did they manage to go from this mess to making an NBA Finals trip literally 1 year later? Well, it all stemmed from incredible management. But change didn't occur immediately. Right after the Celtics were eliminated, it was announced that Danny Ainge was retiring. This ended up being a bit of a lie, as he joined the Utah Jazz a few months later. What really happened was that both sides were ready to part ways. Immediately replacing him was Brad Stevens, the coach, in a move that left the basketball world skeptical. A head coach undertaking the responsibility of trades, free agents, and draft decisions out of nowhere? The jokes write themselves. But rather than this turning into a disaster like many expected it to be, Brad Stevens instead turned out to be one of the greatest executives in the team's history. And he went to work quickly after being promoted. One of Stevens' first moves that helped propel the Celtics from trash to cash was the Kemba Walker trade. Just 2 years after signing the All-Star to a max contract, they kicked him out the door, trading him in a first-rounder to the Thunder for Al Horford. That's right. After leaving and signing with the Sixers for nearly $100 million in 2019, the big fella was back. Stevens was determined to get off Kemba's lengthy contract, so he acquired the also highly paid but less so Horford and gave up a pick to do so. Many viewed this deal as desperate, but in reality, it was a steal. Al Horford turned into an elite starting center for the Celtics that brought immeasurable value, especially in the postseason. 10 days later, Ime Udoka, an assistant coach for various teams over the years like the Sixers, Nets, and Spurs, was brought in as the head coach. Ignoring how this ended, and it's hard to ignore, but bear with me. Ignoring how this ended, in the one quick season he worked with Boston, Udoka was sensational. He brought in a tough, hard-nosed mentality, connecting with the players on the team and rallying them behind him. Him being there, even if it was for a year, taught players like Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown much of the defensive discipline they carry to this day. These were the two major deals in the summer of 2021, but other minor moves like acquiring Josh Richardson for Moses Brown or signing Sam Hauser were also important to the future of the team. On day 1 of the 2021-22 regular season, the Celtics had improved slightly, but overall, they still needed more help. Infamously, they started this year playing 500 basketball, constantly losing games in the most frustrating fashion imaginable. Whether it was blowing big leads, losing to buzzer-beating threes, or failing to execute in crunch time, the Celtics were a miserable watch. The peak of their despair came on January 6, 2022 in a game against the New York Knicks on the road, where the C's blew a 25-point lead, losing on a game-winning bank shot by RJ Barrett, one that left the entire Boston team feeling enraged. It was an unbelievable ending, but it perfectly encapsulated how undisciplined this group was from top to bottom. Did they want to be great, or did they want to give half-effort every game and pray for their talent to bail them out? Fans were demanding Ime Udoka be fired, and some even went as far as to request the breakup of the Jaylen Brown-Jason Tatum duo. It was awful, and all of the rivals were laughing at their hopelessness. But on this very day, something inside the Celtics changed. This was the game-winning shot that transformed them from a mediocre squad to a contending one. At this time, the record stood at 18-21. 1 month later, they were 30-25. They started to win, but the real jump from solid status to contender status came during the 2022 trade deadline, where Brad Stevens played other teams like it was 2K. His best move was trading Josh Richardson, Romeo Langford, and a first to the Spurs for Derek White. White, who wasn't looked at as anything special before this deal, evolved into a phenomenal player for the C's. This trade has turned into a steal. White has been instrumental to the Celtics' success, turning into a lockdown guard with an elite three-point shooting ability. Then, Stevens made 2 moves that cleared up all the useless bench players from the roster. They traded guys like Bol Bol and PJ Dozier to the Magic for a second rounder, and moved Dennis Schroeder, Enes Kanter, and Bruno Fernando to the Rockets for Daniel Tice. Was this deadline a complete overhaul of their team? No. Did they acquire a superstar like their Eastern Conference rival Philadelphia? Also no. But the Celtics made just the right amount of moves to add more to the supporting cast Jason Tatum had been needing, and in that moment, everything clicked. The Celtics were reminded of who they were. In the months of February and March, they went on a rampage, destroying any team that came in their path. They beat the Sixers by damn near 50 points on the road, beat the Nets by 35 at Barclays, and beat the Warriors by 22. They were playing out of their mind, going from 25-25 in late January to 51-31 by the end of the year, which means they went 26-5 in their last 31 games. Why were they so dominant? A few reasons. For one, their three-point shooting during this run was 38%, which ranked number 1 in the league. Secondly, the players started buying into Ime Udoka's system, which prioritized defensive toughness and strong mental fortitude. Most famously, Udoka was once heard asking his team, "Why are you playing like such a-holes?" in the huddle. He knew how to push the right buttons and fire them up like no one else. Lastly, this squad was deep. There were stars like JT and JB, good starters like Rob Williams, Marcus Smart, Al Horford, and key bench pieces like Grant Williams and Derek White. In the 2022 playoffs, the Celtics performed well, first beating the Nets in round 1. The Brooklyn Nets had laid the hammer down on Boston just 1 year prior, and the C's wanted revenge. Many were hyping up this series as one of the greatest, most competitive round 1 matches in NBA history. But the Celtics wiped the floor with Brooklyn, eliminating them in a sweep. This was extremely impressive. The Nets were favored to win it all before the 21-22 season began, but Boston took their lunch money and embarrassed Kevin Durant. KD was locked up. The C's swarmed him on the defensive end and held him to one of his worst performing series in his career. Against the Bucks in round 2 without Chris Middleton, Boston played a little less perfect, even going down 3-2 thanks to a crunch time implosion in Game 5. But they remained focused, even after trailing in this series, and responded well. Jason Tatum famously had an incredible performance in the elimination Game 6 on the road. In Milwaukee, he scored 46 points, hitting dozens of clutch shots to steer the C's to a victory. In Game 7, it was Grant Williams who hit 7 3-pointers to put the Bucks out. This team hit you from every angle, and their excellent run continued as they eliminated the Heat in the conference finals in 7 as well. Nets, Bucks, Heat, all 3 had eliminated the Celtics in years past, and now the C's had gotten revenge. It was a memorable, fantastic run, but unfortunately, this success was remembered by Celtics fans and Celtics fans only. The greater NBA world as a whole doesn't remember who finishes in second place, and unfortunately, in the NBA Finals, the C's will get hit with the reality check. The far more experienced veteran Golden State Warriors were on a mission in the 2022 Finals, and they handed the Celtics the fattest of L's. After Boston opened up to a 2-1 lead, they collapsed, losing 3 in a row. Jason Tatum played horribly. He was locked up by Andrew Wiggins and scored just 13 points on 6 of 18 shooting in the closeout Game 6. Boston's offense fell apart. They failed to score over 100 points in all 3 of the last losses. On the other hand, Steph Curry destroyed the Celtics' vaunted defense that had been locking up stars all playoffs long, scoring 43 points in the huge Game 4 that kept the Warriors' hopes alive. Boston choked, dropping an extremely winnable series. Just like that, their roller coaster season was over. But optimism for the future was still there. However, this finals achieving squad was about to lose one of its most important pieces in the absolute craziest situation imaginable. In September 2022, a bombshell headline was released to sports social media. The Celtics franchise had discovered that head coach Ime Udoka, the heart and soul of the organization, had been having an affair with a female member of the team's staff. This was a direct violation against the franchise's code of conduct, and it would result in a 1-year suspension for Udoka. It was a shocking set of events, and one that especially affected the players. According to Adrian Wojnarowski, the Celtics never got over Udoka's dismissal as the head coach, and it proved to be a huge distraction during their 2022-23 season. Udoka ended up joining the Houston Rockets in April 2023, and his replacement came in the form of the assistant coach, Joe Mazzulla. Mazzulla had been the longest tenured assistant on the team. Since 2019, he had been helping Brad Stevens and Ime from the sidelines. Now, he was getting his big chance. But it was hard to ignore the disaster that had just occurred. In the matter of weeks, the Celtics had lost their coach that they believed would have steered the ship for the next decade minimum. The man in charge of their first finals appearance in 12 years was now gone, replaced by someone with no head coaching experience in Mazzulla. The 2022-23 Boston Celtics were quite the interesting team in retrospect. Their offseason, outside of the coaching disaster, saw them upgrade their depth. They acquired Malcolm Brogdon from the Pacers for half a ketchup packet and a bag of chips, aka Aaron Nesmith and a first-rounder. They then went out and signed Danilo Gallinari, which was a solid pickup, but his production ended up being nothing because he tore his ACL. So all in all, the C's were really just running it back with a new coach. They performed well in the regular season, winning 57 games and earning the second seed. 57 dubs may seem like a lot, but in reality, after starting out 21-5, the C's went just 26-20 in their last 46 games. In the playoffs, it was anything but smooth sailing. They played down to their competition in an embarrassing fashion, taking 6 games to beat the 7th-seeded Atlanta Hawks. Game 5 specifically was nasty work. The Celtics blew a 13-point lead with 6 minutes in the fourth and got beat by a Trae Young game winner. The fact that it took them 6 games to beat a 41-41 team was awful, but their performance in round 2 was just as unimpressive. Against the Philadelphia 76ers, the Celtics were heavily favored, but in Game 1 at home, the Sixers managed to win, beating Boston without their superstar MVP center Joel Embiid. Once again, Boston played down to their competition, in a shameful, humiliating loss where they allowed the corpse of James Harden to drop 45 points. In Game 4, they lost on a game winner to Harden and horribly executed in the fourth quarter and overtime. In Game 5, they got booed by their own fans, being blown out in TD Garden and falling down 3-2.
I believe the Sixers are just better than the Celtics because in the end, if you really boil it down, the best player is Joel Embiid. Right. He's better than Jason Tatum. He's better than Jaylen Brown. He's better certainly than Al Horford or Marcus Smart, or we can keep going down the line.
Luckily, their talent bailed them out from the hole they had dug themselves into. After a terrible first 3 quarters in Game 6, in the fourth, Jason Tatum went off, scoring 16 points to grab the W. In Game 7, JT went off once more, scoring 51 in a dominant showing that sent Joel Embiid and James Harden to Cancun. Listen, a win is a win, but the Celtics had a bad habit of making things quite difficult for themselves and taking way longer than they should have to finish off their opponent. This was especially highlighted in the Eastern Conference Finals, where the Celtics played the 8-seeded Heat, and dropped the first 3 games to face the brink of elimination. Jimmy Butler, Caleb Martin, and the rest of the Heat squad were shredding the Celtics, outplaying them in the fourth quarter of games 1 and 2, and simply destroying them in game 3. It was incredibly disappointing, but if there was one team that could complete the first 3-0 comeback in history, it was these ultra-skilled Celtics. They embarked on just that, winning games 4 and 5, then taking game 6 on the road thanks to a miracle buzzer-beating layup completed by Derek White. Somehow, the Celtics had tied the series, and had all of the momentum heading into Game 7 at home. But on just the first play of this winner-go-home game, Jason Tatum hurt his ankle on a drive to the rim. This stabbed the Celtics in their chest. Immediately, the best player had just lost all of his physical abilities, and no one else was able to step up. Jaylen Brown, handed the reins as the first option, played horribly, shooting 8 of 23, 1 of 9 from 3, and turning the ball over 8 times. He was mocked on social media for his poor dribbling ability, often being pickpocketed when he tried to use his left hand. The Heat blew out Boston and advanced to the finals. The Celtics, once known for their grittiness in 2022, were now being clowned on for their recklessness in 2023. A talented roster with championship aspirations thought all of the glory would be handed to them on a silver platter, only to be defeated by an opponent that simply worked harder for it. This was a wake-up call for Brad Stevens. Despite his best efforts at constructing this team, still more was needed. He had some difficult decisions to make, but rather than panicking, he made the right moves to help them succeed. Immediately once the 2023 offseason began, the Celtics swung for the fences. Marcus Smart, the longest tenured Celtics player of nearly 10 years, was traded to the Grizzlies in a 3-team deal that saw the Celtics receive Kristaps Porzingis and 2 first-round picks. Porzingis then signed an extension. The reasoning for Boston getting picks back as well in this move was because Porzingis was a free agent, and chose to opt into his player option just for this trade. So rather than losing him for nothing, the Wizards sent him to Boston in a multi-team deal. Porzingis may have been the best center the Celtics had had in years, but losing Smart, the veteran leader of the group, was nothing to sneeze at. To clear up more salary, Boston then traded Grant Williams to the Mavs for a few second-rounders. They then gave a ton of moolah to Jaylen Brown, 5 years, $304 million to be exact. The largest contract in NBA history, and a risky move. That's a lot of money for a player who isn't a superstar. But to the Celtics, it showed that they fully believed in a young wing's abilities. They weren't done yet though. A Marcus Smart replacement was needed, but where would they get one? All the elite two-way guards were locked up on contending teams never to be traded. Do my eyes deceive me? The Bucks acquired Damian Lillard, which meant they had to get rid of Drew Holiday to do so. The Celtics saw this and pounced, calling up the Trailblazers, who had gotten Holiday, and put together a deal. Malcolm Brogdon, Rob Williams, and 2 first-rounders were soon shipped to Oregon for none other than Mr. Holiday himself. Marcus Smart replacement? Check. Brad Stevens had done it again. Now, the best starting 5 in the league had been created. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Derek White, and the new guys, Kristaps Porzingis and Drew Holiday. All of them are elite on defense, excel on offense, and play hard. The roster may have been properly adjusted. However, the coaching position was still something that needed to be addressed. Joe Mazzulla's less than stellar 2023 playoff performance had some calling for his head, but Stevens disagreed, and instead allowed Mazzulla to build up his coaching staff. 2 of the league's top assistant coaches, Sam Cassell and Charles Lee, were brought in, along with a plethora of other experienced figures. It made sense why Mazzulla struggled in year 1. He was thrusted into the spotlight, with no familiar faces on his staff, and his players were still left in a daze after the Ime Udoka situation. It ain't easy to win a championship under those circumstances. But now, with some new additions, the players were locked in, and so too was the coach. Of course, dominant success followed. In the 2023-24 season, the Celtics played flawless ball, attaining the best record in the league with the highest point differential. They achieved the most wins in one season since their championship squad back in 2008. No other team matched them in terms of star power. They have the highest offensive rating, not just in the league, but in NBA history. They rank 3rd in defensive rating. From top to bottom, they were a perfectly rounded squad. In 2021, their team was falling apart. They had no good players outside Smart, Tatum, and Brown, had a coach that didn't want to be there, and had little financial flexibility. Now, they have a stacked roster, with their star duo playing better than ever, and a confident coaching staff ready for the challenge. But oh boy, is this challenge a big one. Can they bring home banner number 18? Well, outside of Celtics circles, there's plenty of doubt. There's doubt that Jason Tatum can be the number 1 superstar on a championship-winning squad. There's criticism that Jaylen Brown, who's called overpaid, can't step up in the big moments. There's uncertainty that Kristaps Porzingis can't stay healthy, or doubt that Drew Holiday can produce on offense in the playoffs. There's many who believe that Joe Mazzulla is simply unqualified for the job. At the time of his hiring, many felt that there was no way Brad Stevens would ever be able to replicate winning a championship like his predecessor Danny Ainge did. There's so much skepticism and so many question marks surrounding this team. But now is the perfect opportunity to silence all their challengers who have been vehemently taunting them all these years in the Jason Tatum era. Can they do it? Regardless of what happens, what's undeniable is that the roster is phenomenal. The Celtics, despite all the drama and turmoil that has affected their organization, still remain near the top of the league when it comes to building a contender. Now it's time to execute.